Hey, chess fans. This is Coach Robert. All right, we got another game to go over from our PHCC tournaments. If you are looking for Grandmaster analysis of Grandmaster games, you are in the wrong place. But if you are an amateur player looking for analysis that you can understand of games that look like games you play, you're probably in the right place. Okay, so we have every first, third, and fifth Friday, I have a tournament that I run on Chess Kid with kids that I have been coaching. And started this series where I look at one of the games on the top boards that seems interesting and useful to go over. So far, this is the third video that we've done of this. Each time so far, it has been the last game played by the winner, and this is no exception. So 2 tournaments ago, we featured MontanaDrew and HardyPHCC in a video called "Can You Play the Caro-kann Twice?" Really interesting opportunities in that game. And in the last video, we called it "Don't Blitz Your Quit Games," where we saw HardyPHCC and Flame Panther 9000 miss so many opportunities because of playing too fast. And I almost named this video "Don't Bullet Your Quit Games" because that's how fast this game went. But I'm going to call it differently, because even though they played really, really fast, they did not blunder a whole bunch of, they didn't blunder mate, or they didn't blunder losing pieces or anything like that. But there were just so many tactical shots that they didn't take the time to see. And so I want to make sure we highlight some of these tactics because they're really cool things. Things like where you sack your queen and get checkmate and stuff like that. So this game is between HardyPHCC and MontanaDrew. HardyPHCC won his first 3 games. MontanaDrew got a draw in his first game and then won the next 2, including one against Flame Panther 9000, who was featured in the last video. And so going into this last round, MontanaDrew had a score of 2.5, and HardyPHCC had a score of 3. They were the top 2 scores going in. And at the end, these 2 finished number 1 and number 2 in the tournament. Okay, so let's jump into it. We have, starting out, E4 and C6. This is the move that is MontanaDrew's standard response to E4. He loves to play the caro-kann. He loves to study this one. And so we get a knight F3 followed by D5, offering the exchange. So HardyPHCC accepts the exchange by taking on D5, and Montana captures back. Then we have D4. So all this is just standard caro-kann exchange. This is all book moves. Knight C6 is played. Bishop F4 is played. Again, all these are okay moves. Nothing really, no major gain or loss with these. Then we have Bishop F5. And then Bishop B5. This next move is really the first one I point out. MontanaDrew plays A6. He likes to force White's hand with the exchange. And this is kind of what happened in his game against HardyPHCC as well, where he got where he had the chance to play the caro-kann twice and never did. This move, A6, does force White to make a decision, but it's not really necessary. Another option, probably better, is E6. What this does is, if White decides to capture unprovoked, you still capture back, but now you are in a position where you can develop your bishop already. If White doesn't capture back, so let's go ahead and explore that. Let's say White doesn't capture back, and maybe just develops the knight or castles. Yeah, how about castles? Then you have the chance to bring the knight over, securing your knight on C6. So once you do force the exchange, or once the exchange does happen, you still have the knight targeting the D4 pawn. So not a real big error here with A6. It's just it's a little bit stronger to play E6. Okay. Hardy PHCC goes ahead with the exchange, which is the right move to play. And then we get B takes C6. All this looks very familiar if you watch the game between MontanaDrew and AOM PHCC. All right, we have development of knight C3 and knight F6. And then we get the knight jumping to E5. This is a little aggressive, going ahead and moving your knight across the center of the board when you haven't gotten your king castled. The idea is targeting that C6 pawn, and because MontanaDrew hasn't finished more development with things like E6, the option to play C5, the caro-kann twice, just isn't there yet. There are a few ways MontanaDrew can handle this. The way he did was okay. Probably knight to D7 would have been a little bit better, just because there have been some opportunities to win the pawn back or to chase that knight down. But this is fine. Queen C8, and then castling. Castling is also fine here. This is good. But one thing that Hardy PHCC never takes advantage of is the maneuver knight A4, knight to C5, and landing on this outpost. So there's it's more of a positional thing than a tactical thing. But with the queen sitting here behind the C6 pawn, that pawn's going to move soon, or it should. And so getting this knight over to C5 is really kind of important. But also the knight A4 maneuver threatens a fork on B6. And so that is a tactical shot. The idea of forking the queen and the rook. So Hardy PHCC does miss this, has the opportunity over the next couple of moves. Instead castles. Then we do get E6, getting ready for the what did I just do? Getting ready for the bishop to come into the game. Another alternative would have been to try to again get this knight trade going to take out Hardy PHCC's most active piece. Instead, we then have bishop to G5. Again, maneuvering that knight would have been a little bit better here. And then we have bishop E7. Again, these aren't bad moves. If they had taken their time, MontanaDrew might have found bishop D6 with the idea of queen C7, setting up this battery along the diagonal that includes both the knight and the H-pawn. Okay, and so that actually might have been a way to protect the knight, because the best move would have been for that bishop to go right back to where it was on F4. Instead, we have this bishop E7 move. We get some trades through here, nothing major. Probably, yeah, no major swings through here. But then we've got castle, queen E2. Not real sure where the queen's going, because all of these squares are protected, right? So it's not really doing anything new on E2 that it wasn't doing on D1, because it still has the same diagonal. Sure, if the bishop moves from, well, I don't know, even if the bishop moves, I just don't see any good reason to have this lined up, because the pawn on E6 is kind of fixed. It's not going anywhere. This again was a chance to maneuver the knight. So MontanaDrew pushes the F pawn, which does create a weakness on E6, but this is probably still the best move, just pushing that rook back, and rook comes back to E3. Okay, now we have the chance for some tactics, okay? And this is where the first major tactic that Montana misses. And again, it kind of relates back to that other game, playing the caro-kann twice. He could have done it again. The idea is c5 here, okay? It's not just an exchange of a pawn. Let's take a look at this. If you play c5, it may seem natural for white to capture back with d takes c5, but if they did, that would be a mistake, because then you get to fork the rook and the knight, right? In fact, the best move for white in this position is something like knight to d1, right? Something weird like that. Yeah, you're just going to end up losing this pawn, and you need to be able to have a chance to recapture it, because this rook is going to get kind of stuck. It can't slide over because of the bishop, right? So instead of pushing that pawn to c5, MontanaDrew slides over with rook b8. He has a chance for this tactic a couple of times and misses it each time, because HardyPHCC also slides over with rook b1. Again, this really would have been a good chance for knight to d1 and using that to protect the b2 pawn. Instead, we get rook b1 and then queen b7, and this is really a missed opportunity. The queen sitting behind the c pawn was really where she needed to be. Yeah, because that c5 push was really necessary. There is nothing the queen is going to do over here on b7. It's blocked in by its own pawns along the diagonal. You're never going to attack with the queen in front of the rook, because the queen just becomes a target or gets traded for a lesser value piece. This is just a bluff. There's nothing happening over here, and it just removes the queen. If you're going to move the queen, you know, put it on a good square like c7. But really, the c5 pawn push was really necessary if you really wanted to take advantage of that tactic. At this point, we have HardyPHCC playing a rook exchange, sacking a rook for a pawn and a bishop with check, which is an interesting idea, but it doesn't do anything. This is the sort of sacrifice I make, okay? This is where, hey, this looks cool. I think I'm going to get some tempo. I think I'm going to get some good position, and I throw a piece away and I lose my advantage. And that's exactly what happened here. This probably was the point where HardyPHCC doesn't really get a chance to recover after this. I said it may look threatening because it's got the king in check and you only lost a point. It just doesn't work. There's no follow-up with it. The best move after moving the king out of the way is to recognize, hey, I've got a weak back rank. Okay, HardyPHCC needed to notice that it's got a battery down the B file. Montana's a battery down the B file, and is just one move away from sliding the rook over and getting some major threats at a back rank checkmate. And so HardyPHCC really needed to solve that by either bringing the queen back over to g4 or giving some luft, maybe queen pawn to h4, something like that. Instead plays a4 and giving Montana the opportunity, but remember how the point of this video is missed tactics? Here we go again. Okay, so excuse me. Montana plays rook b to e8. That was the wrong rook. Okay, needed to keep that rook there, because take a look at this. Take a look at this. If rook f e8 is played and the queen retreats, something like this, that's a huge mistake, because you get something like queen takes b2. Like, wait, what? Queen takes b2? That just sacks the queen for checkmate. Literally, that's it. And if you don't take the queen, you scoot over, well, then bye to the knight. Or if you play Luft, goodbye, again, goodbye knight with the threat to exchange rooks. So huge opportunity here. So the only move would have been queen to d6. Why is that? Why does that work? Okay, because if you take the pawn here, then the next move is queen. Sorry, not that way. You which way was it? Let's see. It was, yeah, it was just g3, right? Because now the queen can't take the rook because it just gets lost to the knight, right? Okay, so why was rook b to e8 not the correct sequence? Well, because after queen d6, this is even worse. Because then you get to take the rook, and the rook takes the queen. And now the game's completely flipped. So rook fe8 was important because it takes the rook off of the f8 square. So once the queen moved over, it would be targeting empty space, and that doesn't work. That's why I got confused a second ago, because I forgot that that was when the other rook moves. Okay, so we have rook b to e8. The queen slides over to d6. MontanaDrew attacks the queen again. I think a little bit better might have been coming over here with the queen, because if, again, if the queen goes for the hanging pawn, right, then it's mate into check and mate, right? So no good there. So that pawn's not actually hanging. If the queen goes for the exchange, now you get a chance to double the rooks and try for the checkmate that way too. So again, really needed to pay attention to the weak back rank here to set up the tactics. Okay, instead he threatens the queen again. The queen slides back, and then the rook slides over. Not a bad move, keeping pressure over here, but really needs to get this rook slid over to the e8 square on the open file. Okay. That's going to be another principle throughout this, is put your rooks on open files, okay? They're just better that way. So we get b4, let's see, and then queen to b6. Okay, trying to force the queen trade, but again, rooks on open files. That's what you need to go for. We do get the exchange. A5 is played. The rook slides back, which this is good. Moving it to b7 instead of b8. That does give the opportunity to double later. The king slides over, trying to first that does prevent any back rank mate threats. There we go, back rank mate threats. But also gives the king a chance to come into the game and start walking his way up. The rooks double up, putting a target on the b4 pawn, forcing the knight to go to a2, and now really kind of have white's pieces taken out of the game, trying to protect this a4 pawn to prevent the rooks from infiltrating. So black has a chance to start marching the king in. MontanaDrew could march the king in or move a pawn and get the king going. Excuse me. Plays rook c7. Not real sure what the rook is doing there. It's not. There's no major problems with that move. There is a possibility of the idea of pushing the pawn. And if the pawn takes, then the rook can recapture because of the pawn recaptures, then you capture the rook with check, and then it's a rook versus a knight, and yeah. So that maybe that's what MontanaDrew was thinking. I'm not sure. So the king moves in, and MontanaDrew moves the rook again a second time. If it might have been best just to go ahead and go to rook e7 on the last move rather than stopping at c7 first. The king comes up to d3. MontanaDrew puts his rook in. This probably, it probably would have been a better time to double up now, right? That way the front rook could come here and try to sweep out these pawns, or come all the way down and try to trade off the rook on b1. Instead plays rook to e4 and f3 to chase the rook, and MontanaDrew plays rook h4. This is, you know, he's winning. He's got more material, so it's not awful, but he takes his rook off the open file. Don't take your rook off the open file. They don't do as good of a job, especially sandwiched between pawns like we have here. He's got 3 of his own pawns and 3 of his opponent's pawns. And now the rook is just kind of enclosed and doesn't really have a whole lot of space to move. So it's just not a great idea. And the only way, if the pawns go forward too much, then the rook kind of gets stuck, and MontanaDrew has to play his own pawns forward to give himself some space. And you just have to be careful with that, because remember, pawns don't move backwards. Okay, so we have HardyPHCC slides his rook over to h1. MontanaDrew plays f5, which is pretty good because it does give the chance to get the rook out if necessary. h3 is played. MontanaDrew steps back to h5. Interestingly, he could have stepped up to h3, and with the rook on h3, yeah, the pawn, the rook on h1 is kind of stuck guarding the h2 pawn, and so that would have been an interesting move as well. So he plays rook h5, which is totally fine, almost as strong as rook h3. g4 is played, not as good. We get rook h3 after the exchange of pawns with check, and excuse me, king moves to d2. Montana's next move is rook h4. Totally fine. The move is totally fine, but there was a chance to play rook to a3, threatening the knight. And if the knight moves, then you get the free pawn. Right? So let's take a look at that, because that's not the only option. Okay, let's say rook a3, knight c1. There goes the b4 pawn, and the rooks have infiltrated. Okay, so if you want to keep your knight guarding that, maybe rook a1. Okay, so you could go ahead and take and trade off. The problem is then you lose your a6 pawn, right? So you probably don't want to trade yet. Instead, just, you know, rook f8. Rook f8 threatens rook f4, which would attack both the g4 pawn and the d4 pawn. If the king steps up, sorry, can't step up that way. The king steps up, you can still bring that in. If there's really no way for white to save the pawns in this position. So at that point, maybe c4. Nope, that doesn't work, because you get rook f2 winning the knight, so you can't play c4. So maybe h3. Again, the rook comes in, right? So there's just no real good moves for white after rook f8. But instead of playing rook a3 in this position, MontanaDrew played rook h4. Again, totally fine. H3 is played, trying to keep that g4 pawn safe. MontanaDrew played g6, a little slow. H5 would have been fine. HardyPHCC starts bringing in his king to try to help. So king f3 here this is probably the only time a piece is actually hung in that exchange earlier. The g4 pawn is not safe, right? You don't have any protection of the g4 pawn. The king is not protecting g4 because the rook is sitting here. And the h3 pawn is not protecting g4 because it is pinned to the rook. So there's actually no protection of the g4 pawn. So Montana is able to take the g4 pawn for free. HardyPHCC slides over to threaten the rook. And again, here's a really interesting tactic. Montana plays rook takes h3, which is not the best. There's a better move, and that is g5. You play g5. What's White's follow-up? White can't take the g4 pawn, right? Because then the rook falls. But if White doesn't take the g4 pawn, then Black is going to take the g4 pawn, and you have a protected passed pawn, and your rook is safe from the g5 pawn. So just a kind of an in-game tactic here. Just protecting the rook with the g pawn would have been the best move. Instead, he captures the pawn, and we get a couple of exchanges. And at this point, it's mostly cleanup work. The knight can't move from a2 until the rook moves from b8. So once we get into this position, Black needs the help of the rook to push through. And so uses that to just kind of slowly work the pieces down the board. Knight e2 does miss another tactic. That is knight d3. Knight d3, both knight e2 and knight d3 threaten the rook, but knight d3 also threatens knight c5 and knight takes a6, creating a passed pawn for White, right? And so that actually was a threat, but it probably would not have been enough to win the game. So we get knight e2, the rook slides over, king f3, we get a check, the king has to step back. MontanaDrew starts maneuvering his king around. And again, it's just slowly getting that pawn moved forward further and further. We have b5 as a last-ditch effort to create the passed pawn, but when MontanaDrew captured back with the c pawn, HardyPHCC resigned, recognizing there was nothing he was going to be able to do. The knight was going to have to move, and once the knight moved, the king was going to be able to come in and continue pushing that pawn. And so that was it. That was the game. MontanaDrew came into this last game with 2.5 points. HardyPHCC had 3. But in the end, MontanaDrew won, and with 3.5 points, won the tournament over HardyPHCC's 3 points. So it was actually a really good game. They did play really fast. I think maybe only used like between 3 to 5 minutes out of their 15. So they did still play a bit too fast, but as a consequence, they missed their tactics. Work tactic puzzles. Don't play your games too fast. Give yourself some time to see those tactics and look for them in the game. So good game, good tournament overall. Kids, several of the kids that were playing in this tournament had a tournament the very next day. The Texas State Online Scholastic Championship. So that's going to happen tomorrow. And so hopefully they'll have some good games there too and represent our region, represent our club really well. Okay, so continue to check back for more videos. And if you are subscribed to the channel, you'll get notifications. And so hopefully we'll see you in a new video coming up soon. All right, keep playing chess, work those tactic puzzles.